It is June the 2nd, about 10 days since the fall of Bakhmut, and we are starting to get news of several Russian offensive actions that are picking up steam and making some gains. The Ukrainians once again have tried to cross the Russian border into the Belgorod region, this time at a different location where it appears they have had less success. We also are getting word from some sources that another entrenched Ukrainian Donbass city may fall in the coming days in a bit of a surprise twist. All of this in today's Frontline report. This is going to be a more traditional full front report as we are seeing slight territorial changes all up and down the battlefield. So we're going to start with the area of Volchansk Shebekino, which is on the border between Kharkiv and Belgorod. This is actually north of Kharkiv, where the Ukrainian side has attempted a border crossing and attacked into Russia, allegedly in the direction of Novaya Tavlzhanka. This attack was once again carried out by the Free Russia Legion, a group of ethnic Russians fighting on the side of Ukraine as Russian rebels. According to the Russians, the attack involved 2 Ukrainian tanks, both of which they claim to have destroyed, along with a rather intense shelling of both military and civilian infrastructure in the surrounding area. As of now, the intense shelling continues, but there are no cross-border battles on either side. Next, we will go to Kupiansk, where the Russian army have made several advances in the forest to the north of the city. The front line allegedly now sits only 1.5 kilometers from the city itself. Just in the last couple of weeks, Russian forces assaulted and captured Ukrainian positions in the small village of Masyutivka and claimed an advance and bridgehead across the Oskil River. While it is clear at this point that either the bridgehead was abandoned or it never existed, the Russian army has turned their attention to the south, capturing most of the forests in the area. If the Ukrainians fail to stop the Russians here and allow the fall of outlying towns such as Sinkivka or Petropavlovka, then the Russians will be in a position to seriously threaten Kupiansk and potentially force a Ukrainian retreat from their positions further to the south around Svatova. In the last update, I spoke about Bilogorovka and the advances that Russo-Chechen troops made in the forest to the north of town, pulling it into a semi-encirclement. Since I did that video update, we now have some more reliable sources coming out and plotting those Russian gains. So the area I had marked does appear smaller than it was in the last video update. I do feel this is significant enough to point out because as long as the Russian side hasn't consolidated their gains, controlling a thin salient can be treacherous, and the Ukrainian army stands a much better chance of counterattacking and recapturing the area. Full disclaimer though, based on some reports coming from the battlefield, the Russians do seem like they are trying to continue expanding this bridgehead rather than sitting back in a defensive posture. So there is a chance the next update might show more Russian gains here or potentially rolling them back. Further to the south of Bilogorovka, there are some significant gains, but before we get into the details of that, I would just like to remind everyone to please consider hitting both the like and subscribe buttons, actions that are totally free for you to do, but are a big help for me to grow the channel. Also consider hitting that bell icon so you do not miss the next update. For several days now, the Russian army has been attacking in the area of Spurne, a section of battlefield that has been highly contested and where it is often difficult to determine who controls what. We have received information that confirms the Russians have expanded their zone of control significantly to the northeast of town and have actually finally re-entered the town and now control somewhere around a dozen structures. I say re-enter because at one point last year Russia actually had control over Sporne, or at least they claimed control over Sporne, and the battle had moved to the west closer to Ivanodorovka, which is kind of lightly pictured here at the top right hand or top left hand corner of your screen. After the Ukrainians collapsed the Russian northern flank around Balaklia and Izium, the Russians were forced back to the Bakhmut-Lysychansk road during a general full front full frontal Ukrainian attack. So this has taken months for the Russians to partially even return to these positions. As for the area of Bakhmut, we do have some map updates here, and they did not all necessarily take place in the last 2 days. This is over the last 10 days. Just various things have been updated by different mappers. So first off, the Ukrainians have been conducting some assault actions in the area. This one is a bit more recent, seizing the ground in the valley just to the south of Orekovo-Vasilivka. The Ukrainian army had also previously taken over some more Russian defensive positions directly to the west of Klishchivka. So I believe this one actually happened a couple days before. The previous one around Orekovo-Vasilivka is much more recent. Meanwhile, Russian forces recaptured some ground adjacent to the reservoir to the west of Yegidny. Fresh Russian army regulars that recently took over for Wagner mercenaries in Bakhmut have expanded the Russian zone of control outside of the city somewhat marginally. There has been some ground captured down the road to Ivanivsky, and reports suggest that the town of Kromove is actually in the gray zone and is occupied by neither side. Further to the south of town, it does appear like the Russian motorized infantry has stabilized the southern flank and recaptured some of the ground previously lost along the Donbass Canal. And I do have this presentation set up, but I am going to zoom out here because I was kind of jumping around. I hadn't practiced that, and it might have been a little bit confusing for people. So just an overhead look here. The Ukrainians have taken some ground towards Klishchivka, also some ground in the area of Dubova-Vasilivka. This is, potentially a big problem for the Russians, but the Russians have moved back into some territory they previously lost to the west of Yegidny, captured new territory on the outskirts of Bakhmut, and recaptured some territory on the flanks as well. So, overall, the front line around Bakhmut, in my opinion, appears to be just balancing out and flattening out. The next area we are going to touch on is Avdiivka, where a lot of fighting has been taking place, but admittedly neither side has much to show for it. Reports suggest that the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack in the direction of Krasnogorovka, perhaps recapturing some positions along the railroad north of town. I say perhaps because I personally never had these positions marked on my map as being controlled by Russia to begin with. Not saying it wasn't true, I'm just saying that I never saw the intel. One small but potentially significant advance by the Russians actually took place further to the northeast along the bend in the railroad. Russian troops managed to gain a foothold along the first forest hedgerow on the eastern side of the railroad track in the direction of Karamik and Novokalinove. While this isn't an immediate game changer, it might be a signal as to the direction the Russian army is trying to move. From here, the Russians can try to move into the forests south of Novokalinove and get a good position to springboard into the small conglomeration of settlements. Now, finally coming around to Marinka, where perhaps some of the biggest news is coming from over the last few days. Some footage has trickled in of heavy fighting in the town, and some claims from various pro-Russian channels say that the Russian army is attempting to storm the final Ukrainian-held section of town, and Marinka could be under complete Russian control by tomorrow. Now, I do want to say that these are overly ambitious claims. Just looking at the way that the war has been fought so far, the Ukrainians don't tend to lose large swaths of territory overnight, especially if it's in an urban environment. The Ukrainian army has proven that they are willing and able thus far to shed blood for every single structure in these Donbass cities that they cling on to. That being said, the situation in Marinka is not favorable for the Ukrainian army either. Russian forces have managed to consolidate their control over the central commercial district of town and are now pushing into the final residential neighborhoods. On the northern flank of town, the Russian army has also seized a key warehouse that could be used to cut off a pocket of Ukrainian resistance. If the reports are true that Russia is planning on capturing the rest of Marinka very soon, then I believe this process could take as long as 2 weeks. But obviously, I have been wrong before, and I will be wrong again. So, looking at the overall battlefield is worth talking about the patterns that are forming here. Starting with the Ukrainians, the probing in the Belgorod region continues. While so far both of the attacks Ukraine has launched into the region have failed to capture and hold any ground, it appears like Ukraine didn't have the resources present to do this in either situation. And what I mean by that is actually permanently hold on to some of these regions. So, some people have claimed that Ukraine might be trying to capture some parts of Russia that that they could use in exchange in some kind of peace deal to get other parts of Ukraine back. They haven't managed to hold on to either of these places. In my opinion, they haven't used enough equipment or troops to do that. So that signals that there's potentially a bigger or different plan here. It's possible that Ukraine might be trying to draw in Russian reinforcements in the misdirection so that they can attack elsewhere, or perhaps they could just be seeking a few PR victories. It's really, really tough to tell what exactly the Ukrainian plan is here. In terms of the Russian army, it appears like resources have been transferred away from Bakhmut and to the same battlefields that the Russians failed to dominate over the winter. And I'm not saying that the Russians were defeated in these places, but the idea was definitely for them to capture them, and they didn't manage it. Kupiansk, one of the areas that didn't see a major Russian attack over the winter, might present the Russians with an opportunity. Places like Kreminna, Bilogorovka, Avdiivka, and Marinka are finally beginning to see some territorial changes after months of constant fighting. All appear to be in favor of the Russians at this point. So while things are starting to spice up, there isn't any sign that either side is in the middle of a major offensive operation. At this point, there are several smaller battles being raged at a more local level, but that's about it. So that is all for me today. Next time, along with the battlefield updates, I will be talking about some major news regarding the global economy. I want to thank everyone for joining, and until next time.